All right. Okay. Parshas Behaalos'cha in Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Yud talks about the Jewish people rebelling, and Vayishma Moshe Sam Boch LeMishpachosav. So Moshe heard the nation, the people crying LeMishpachosav. Now the simple explanation, weeping with their families. Ish lepesach lo, each one at the entrance of his tent. Vayicharaf Hashem ma'od, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu became very angry. God became angry. Uve'eni Moshe ra, and Moshe Rabbeinu considered what the Jewish people doing as to be ra, as to be evil. Now, there is the Chazal tell us in the Gemara in Shabbos that what does it mean? Vayishma Moshe Sam Boch LeMishpachosav. The simple explanation, of course, is that together with their families they were crying. But the Chazal say there is an additional meaning, and Rashi brings it down in his Parish and Chumash, Mishpachos, Nesafim. Different families were gathering together, ubochim lefarsem taru museim begoli, in order to make their tinus, their complaints, public. In a sense, it was a form of a demonstration. Rabbeinu Amru lemishpachosav, but there is an additional explanation. Lemishpachosav al iske mishpachos, al harayos shenesros lahem. In other words, because there is a prohibition of incest. Incest is considered a terrible sin, but there are additional incestual relationships that are prohibited to a Jew because of the Torah that are not prohibited on non-Jews. And apparently, the custom was to marry within the family. Now, of course, the Jewish people did not have marriages that were prohibited to them because of incest. But when the prohibited marriages that were considered incestual was increased, so certain families, certain husbands had to give their wives a divorce. Moshe Rabbeinu's parents, after Matan Torah, according to Chazal, had to take a divorce because she was the aunt of Moshe Rabbeinu's father. So they got divorced because many families, because of the halachas of the Torah, the additional prohibitions of the Torah, had to get divorced. And of course, this caused sadness and to a certain degree protest among the Jewish people. And there's a famous question from the Maral in the Gurarie. The question is, we know there's a special halacha of ger shenisgayer kekatan shenola dami. A ger, if somebody undergoes conversion, so he has the halacha, he all his relatives that he had previously are no longer considered relatives. And even if those relatives will undergo gerus themselves, they're not considered relatives. So the question is, why is it that the Jewish people became prohibited to people that they became married to because of the increased prohibitions, incestual prohibitions that were given at the time of the Torah. After all, at the time of the Torah, all the Jews underwent gerus, underwent conversion. And when you undergo conversion, ger sheniskayer kekatan shenolad dami. Someone who undergoes conversion and becomes a ger. So he's like born anew. And all the previous relationships that he had before are not legally binding. So how is it? Why were they crying? Now my uncle gave a teretz to that question, gave an answer to that question, which is a very good answer. He said there was a difference between the gerus at the time of Matan Torah, the conversions that took place at the time of Matan Torah, and your regular gerus situation. In your regular gerus situation, each individual undergoes his own gerus. However, at the time of Matan Torah, so the Jewish people as a group, as a nation, underwent gerus. When do we say that when one undergoes conversion, that all his previous relationships cease to exist? That's when they undergo individual gerus. But when the Jewish people undergo gerus, undergo conversion as a nation, so the relationships that they had between each other continue to exist. And my father actually went on to say that the conversion at the time of Matan Torah, in other words, because the patriarchs, many say it explicitly, there are those who disagree, but it seems that the accepted opinion is that the patriarchs and the earlier generations, even before Matan Torah, had some status as Jewish people. And my father would say that before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, they had the personal Kedushas Yisrael, the individual Kedushas Yisrael. But at Matan Torah, there was the Kedushas Yisrael, the sanctity of the Jewish people as a nation. And every Jew today has two forms of Kedushas Yisrael. You have the sanctity of that every Jew has as an individual. But in addition, every Jew is part of a holy nation. And the conversion that took place at the time of Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah, even though the Jews previously had conversion, had Kedushas Yisrael, had the conversion that took place at Matan Torah was to bestow upon them the sanctity of the nation, to bestow the sanctity of being a holy nation. Up till that time, they were holy individuals. But from that point on, not only that they were holy individuals, but they became a holy nation. But in any case, the conversion of Matan Torah was one, according to my uncle, that took place as part of a nation. And according to my father, it bestowed the holiness of the nation. Now, so I want to suggest, and while my uncle's teretz is certainly true, I want to suggest another possible answer. Sometimes we could have more than one answer to a question, and the answers do not necessarily contradict each other. I want to suggest, but based on a thought that I have said in the past. Now, in Parshas Chayesara, Avraham Avinu marries Keturah. According to our sages, this is toward the end of his life. according to our sages, this after Sarah passed away. Actually, after Yitzchak marries Rivka, so Avraham marries Keturah. And according to our sages, Keturah was Hagar. But Avraham had sent Hagar away at the insistence and with the approval of Sarah, with the approval of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And now he, so to say, remarried her. And Rashi, the Das Geinim of Behaalos'cha asks the question: How now Hagar was the Hagar was the daughter, according to our sages, of Paro. When Avraham went down to Egypt, so Hagar became a shivcha, a maidservant of Sarah. And then Sarah gave her over to Avraham to marry. That time, Sarah thought that she wouldn't have any children. And she thought that maybe she would be able to bring up children of Avraham through Hagar. Eventually, the rift that took place between Sarah and Hagar and the way Yishmael acted necessitated that Hagar leave the camp of Avraham. But later on, Hagar does tshuva. Yishmael also, to a certain degree, does tshuva. And Avraham retakes her as a wife. Hagar as a wife. And so the Das Kainim of Behaalos'cha asks, even though before Matan Torah, most of the mitzvahs of the Torah were not incumbent upon the Jewish people, not incumbent upon the avos, not incumbent on the patriarchs, not incumbent on the matriarchs and the imos, but nevertheless, the avos and probably the imos also chose to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah, even though those mitzvahs were not yet incumbent upon them. And the question is, well, the Keturah, who was Hagar, so she was a mistress. She was an Egyptian woman. And the halacha is that an Egyptian woman, even after she goes gerus, even after she goes conversion, a Jew is not allowed to marry. She's a psul kol. So how was Avraham allowed? How is it? Let me say that question over. How is it that Avraham married Torah, but the avos, the patriarchs, observed the whole Torah, even though it was not yet required, and one is not allowed to marry a mistress, a woman who had been an Egyptian. And so the Das Kener Behaalos'cha mentions two answers. The first answer he gave was Avraham was a ger. Avraham underwent conversion. And because he underwent conversion, so the halacha is that certain women who are prohibited, who there is a prohibition on Jews to marry, but gerim are allowed to marry them. And since Avraham was a ger, Avraham underwent gerus, so he was allowed to marry. He married Keturah, even though she had been a mistress. And then he says it was al pi adibur, The second teretz is there was a special dispensation given from heaven for him to marry her. There are other possible answers. I'm not going to go into them now. I've discussed it in the past. Now, it's mentioned that the Brisker Rav very strongly objected. I didn't hear what he said about the Das Kenim Behaalos'cha, but the Brisker Rav very strongly objected to the idea that Avraham was a ger, that Avraham was a convert. Now, I want to explain why the Brisker Rav. He said Avraham was not a ger. A ger is someone who joins the Jewish people. But Avraham, he was the foundation of the Jewish people. So you couldn't call him a ger. A ger is someone who joins the Jewish people. Avraham was the first Jew. So I just want to explain. I once heard from my father, Zatzal, that the word, he mentioned, I think in the name of the Ibn Ezra, that the word ger comes from the word gargir, a seed. A seed is something that doesn't have roots yet. When a ger joins the Jewish people, and to a certain degree, the gerus, a ger is said. My uncle discusses in the shiurim that were printed, and I heard the same thought in a sort of different manner from my father, that a ger is someone who does chesed, is doing kindness to the Jewish people. So why is it? Because a ger, in a sense, does not yet have roots in the Jewish people, and yet that person joins the Jewish people. So I think this is what the Brisker Rav meant to say. Avraham wasn't a ger because a ger is someone that doesn't have roots yet. He is going to his descendants will have roots, but he himself does not yet have roots. So because of that, the Avraham was the root of the Jewish people. So as I mentioned, the word ger is identified with gargir, a seed. A seed is something that doesn't have roots, but it has the potential of having roots, of being a root, and of having roots. So this was the question that the Brisker Rav raised against those who suggest that Avraham was a ger. He said Avraham was the foundation. He was the root of the Jewish people. So how could we identify Avraham as being a ger? And he therefore gave the same answer that as the second answer of the Das Kenim Behaalos'cha, that it was al pi hadibur. It was because God advised him or told him, or he received a heavenly message, I guess would be a better way of saying it. There was a heavenly message for him to marry Keturah. Okay, but I just want to point out that there is, I guess, if the Brisker Rav could disagree with the Kenim Behaalos'cha, he could disagree also with Yanai. Yanai was from the early Paitanim. He wrote the early Piyutim. Yanai lived about 1,500 years ago. He was more or less close to the time of Chasimas HaTalmud. And one of the Piyutim that he composed was the piyut that is recited at the end of the Haggadah. Oz nisim hifleisa balayla, Rosh Hashmorah zehalayla, get sedech nitzachto kinechlak lalayla. This piyut discusses the miracles that happened at night, because Pesach night we talk about miracles that happen at night. How the Jewish people, the Makas Bechoros, how Paro told the Jewish people in the middle of the night, leave Egypt. He gave them their freedom. So in this piyut, other miracles that happened that night are mentioned. And the first miracle that is listed is the miracle of Avraham's victory in the war between the kings, when his nephew Lot, who had already left him, who had already become a resident of Sodom, and he was taken prisoner in the war. And because of that, but in referring to Avraham, and Avraham was victorious in the war, and that was miraculous. So it refers to Avraham as a ger tzedek, as a righteous ger, a righteous convert. Okay, it's possible that the Brisker Rav just disagreed with Yanai. But I want to suggest another possible answer. Perhaps it's really two answers. You can see it as one answer. Now, and then there's another question that has to be asked in regard to Gerus. So the Gemara says that when somebody undergoes conversion, so the Beis Din meets with him, and they ask him all kinds of questions. And the Rambam says, Bodkin Achrav, that not only do they ask him questions, but they check after him to see if he will be a true Jew, to see if he will be dedicated to the Torah, to see if he will be really part of the Jewish people. This is a question has been coming up lately. I hear that articles have been written. I can't say that I saw those articles about the absurdity of converting people who want to be Jewish and at the same time are joining the enemies of the Jewish people, are becoming supporters of the murderers who put children in the ovens, who participate in the October 7th massacre. These are not people who are committed to the Torah. They're not committed to the Jewish people. And anybody who converts them, Srichim Dikachrav. So they question him, they check after him, and then once they feel sure that he meets the standards that are necessary for being part of the Jewish people, Molinoso miyad, he's circumcised right away. We do the Gerus quickly. And the Gemara says, what's the significance of doing the Gerus quickly? Why is it emphasized? Because we don't postpone a mitzvah. There is a mitzvah where a person is worthy of Gerus. He lives up to the standards that are necessary for Gerus. You shouldn't postpone. You should do it right away. And the Gemara says, why? Because we don't postpone doing mitzvahs. And Rishonim ask, what is the mitzvah that is involved in performing gerus? And there are two answers given, and both explanations. There are more, but the two main answers are the Riyar Bartzolani and the Ravid in Bala Nefesh. The Riyar Bartzolani says that there is a mitzvah of a hafta mesager. There's a mitzvah of love of the ger, over and above the mitzvah of loving every Jew and acting in a manner that is demonstrative of love and concern for every Jew. There's a special mitzvah of having love and concern for the ger. So the reason we do the gerish right away is because of the mitzvah of Abbas ger. Now, that answer is somewhat difficult because at that point, he is not yet the ger. Because until we actually perform the gerus, not only perform the gerus, until the gerus is complete, he's not yet a ger. So how could you say that we are required to start the process of gerus because of the mitzvah of love of a ger when he is not yet a ger? He has not yet been converted. So we and then there's the Rabbi Ravid gives another pasuk that says it's a mitzvah to perform gerus. And that's the mitzvah sanefesh asher asu b'charan. It's mentioned that when Avraham left Charan, and he went to Eretz Canaan, al Eretz asher areka. So that Avram took with him the nefesh asher asu b'charan. Now the simple explanation nefesh asher asu b'charan. The simple explanation was this was his servants and his maidservants that they had. However, our sages explain that these were the converts that Avram and Sarah made. That Avram Megayer Nashim, Avram converted men, Sarah Megayeres Nashim, Sarah converted women. Means that she served as an influence upon them to convert, to recognize monotheism. So now the question is, at that time, when they were in Haran, there wasn't real gerus yet. There was no Jewish people. There was no Jewish person yet. So what's the mitzvah? Now, that obviously, but more than that, just the further explanation, a nefesh asu b'charan doesn't even apply a mitzvah, but by the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, the mitzvah of love of God. So Chazal tell us, Heve kavram, be like Avram, who took people, who brought people to HaKadosh Baruch Hu under the influence of God. So it's part of the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, of love of God. Now, the problem is that at that point in Haran, there wasn't the Jewish people, there wasn't gerus, there wasn't anything. But what we could say is that there might not have been ger tzedek. They didn't become Jews, but there's a concept of ger toshav. Who is a ger toshav? A ger toshav is one who accepts or is committed to the Shiva mitzvos b'nei Noach, the observance of the 7 basic mitzvos that were given to the descendants of Noach. But if it's only ger, the question is, if it's only a ger toshav, if they were only geri toshav, so how can we learn from that there's a mitzvah to perform conversion, to convert people to be Jewish? They weren't Jewish. But the answer that many give for this is, in other words, at that time, when Avraham was still in Haran, before Avraham got the command, and before he left to Eretz Canaan, to the land of Canaan, that was the highest level that a person could reach, was to be a ger toshav. That was the highest level. But as the concept of Judaism was developed by the halacha, when Avraham became Jewish, became a separate nation, so the higher standards became higher. So the es hanefesh sherasu b'charan, avas Hashem, bringing them close to God, tachas kanfei hashchina, under the wings of the Shechina, bringing them under the wings of the Shechina, applies bringing them to the highest level possible. So we can learn out from here regarding the mitzvah of Avas Hashem as well. Okay, but in any case, as far as the Ri'ar Solani is concerned, the question is, how could it be a mitzvah of Avas Ger? They were not yet Gerim. They were not converts yet. So there are 2 answers, and the truth of the matter is, the 2 answers might be one answer. You could say that when a person undergoes the process of conversion, he is already considered a ger, a convert. But we have to understand, why should it be that way? Why should it be that way? What I want to suggest is that there are 2 forms of gerus. Now, I mentioned before that when it comes to conversion, the word ger comes from the word gargir, a seed. It doesn't have roots. But when one undergoes gerus, on one hand, they're cutting themselves off from their past. They're cutting themselves off from their previous nation. They're cutting themselves off to a large degree from their previous family, certainly legally. And so, in a sense, they don't have roots, not in the former nation, because they cut themselves off from the former nation. And they cut themselves off. And then when they join the Jewish people, they don't have roots in the Jewish people yet either. So a ger is a ger in a double manner. He no longer has roots. He no longer has roots among the nations of the world. But he has not yet established, he's a seed, but he has not yet established roots among the Jewish people. And perhaps this is the reason why there's a special mitzvah to show love to Gerim, because in a sense they are in this insecure position, and it's a certain mesiras nefesh that they show. Now, so we could say, as far as the Ri'ar Solani is concerned, yes, he did not undergo gerus of becoming part of the Jewish nation, but since he started the process of Gerus, he, in a sense, cut himself off from the roots of his nation, from his previous nations, his previous association to a large degree. And so Memela, the mitzvah of Abba Seger applies to him. It's interesting that the Chinuch says that the mitzvah Abba Seger even applies to a newcomer who moves into a neighborhood, someone who does not yet have friends in the neighborhood. How is he a ger? But he's a ger because he doesn't have roots in his situation. To a certain degree, he's lonely. He's alone. Today, that's not as extreme as it was in the old days. Today, you have telephones. You travel by plane. You never really cut yourself off completely. But in the old days, if you move from one town to the other, you were a ger. Perhaps not in the legal sense, but in the social sense. So someone who is in the process of undergoing gerus, if he's sincere, also is a ger. And I think that perhaps could be the explanation by Avraham Avinu also, according to the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav does not have to reject what Yanai said in this piyut of Vayihi b'chatzi halayla. Avraham Avinu, at that point, he did not yet have bris milah. He did not yet go through the whole process of gerus. Did not complete the process of gerus. But at what point does Avram's gerus, the process of gerus, begin? The process of gerus begins, and so first of all, Avram might not have been a ger in the Jewish people, because he was the foundation of the Jewish people. He was the root of the Jewish people. But he was a ger because he cut himself off from his previous family, from his friends, from his country. Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha. Leave your land and your birthplace and your father's house. My father, and it's the same question I saw in the name of Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim uses a different approach. The question is, the words are out of order. First, the person leaves their house, then they leave their city, then they leave their country. And here it says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your country, leave your birthplace, and leave your father's house. The first thing that you leave should be the father's house. Okay, there's a machlokis at what point he was given this command, but the father's house should be the first thing that you're leaving. The house is the first thing that you should be leaving. Why is that mentioned as the last thing? You leave your house first. Let's say I live in Chicago, so I leave my house first, then I leave Chicago. And then if I'm going to Israel, I'll be leaving the United States. And here it's in the reverse order. So my father said, physical leaving is one thing, emotional leaving. Cutting oneself off is another way. It's easier to cut yourself off from the heritage, from the culture of your land. But the memories of your neighborhood, of your friends, that remains for a while. And then, even after you have overcome those ties, the last thing to cut off is the memories and the associations, the attitudes, I should say, of your family. So lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha is in that order. So Avram, when did his process of gerus begin? His process of gerus began when he got the command of lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha. That's the point where he cuts himself off from his past. He's a ger. He's not a ger, or not yet a ger, depending on your opinion, among the Jewish people. He did not yet undergo bris milah. He did not yet, perhaps even yet, form the Jewish nation, although he was told that he will be the father of the Jewish nation. But he was a ger. The process of gerus began at that point, and at that point he was already a ger, because gerus involves not just accepting to be part of the Jewish nation, but to a large degree to cut yourself off from this, to the associations, from the heritage of your previous life. And so in a sense, and at that point, before the laws of gerus were given, before the establishment of the idea of being a Jew was revealed, so at that point, the highest form of gerus, the closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu manifests itself in cutting yourself off from the nations of the world who were not dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who were not dedicated to God. So Avraham at that point was a ger tzedek, because at that point, that was the highest form of gerus. It's true, he underwent bris milah later. He became a Jew later. But at that point, he was a ger tzedek because he cut himself off from his background. And it's interesting. There is a contrast there between Avraham and Lot. Lot leaves Avraham, and he goes to Sdom. And Avraham recognizes in its constant separation. And Avraham has to separate himself from Lot. All of that is part of the process. All that is part of the process of gerus. So by Avraham, there were two parts to the gerus, two separate parts. One cutting himself off from his past. The other part of the gerus was the establishing the Jewish people, becoming the foundation of the Jewish people. And so that's why Yanai said, ger tzedek, in that point, even though it was before the bris milah, that was the highest form of gerus available at that point. In Sachto, you made him victorious in his fight. And it's interesting, when he talks about Avraham being a ger, Yanai, he talks about him going to save Lot, who separated himself from the camp of Avraham, who joined the people of Sdom, even though morally he was different to a large degree than the people of Sdom. Why is it that way? But I'll get back to that. But I want to suggest, as far as the question of the Gurarye, the question of the Maharal was, why is it that the relationships that when the Jewish people at the time of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, they went through gerus. So at that point, they should have lost all relationships. Ger sheniskaya kakatan shenola dami. So what forms of incest could be added to them? They weren't related to each other anymore. They just underwent conversion at the time of Matan Torah. It's an additional conversion. But even the additional conversion, why don't we say Gersh and Iskaya Kakat and Shanola Dami? They're like, it's newly born. But the answer, I think, is Geras has this double element in it. Of course, it's joining the Jewish people. But in addition to joining the Jewish people, it's the finalization of the breaking of the nations that you were associated with the culture that you were associated with the attitudes that were part of the culture of the nations that you were associated with. The Jewish people at the time of Matan Torah were not cutting themselves off from their past. On the contrary, they were strengthening their associations with the past. They were strengthening their association with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, with future generations. The Geras at the time of Matan Torah was only one of formation of the Jewish people, of Tosfos Kedusha, of adding more Kedusha. But it didn't manifest itself, chas v'shalom, in cutting themselves off. Geras that is a valid Geras, that is not identified with cutting yourself off from the past, doesn't cut off the relationships of the past. That's how we could answer the question of the Maharal. Now, I think that there is important, we have 10 more minutes. There's this important idea behind this, that when it comes now, my father, and I've talked about this many times, and it's so important when the events that are taking today, when these events are taking place, when Jews are being discriminated against, Jews are being murdered, Jews are being killed, people, and who does the world protest against? The world protests against the Jew. And what is unfortunate is that you find some Jews who we could say are anti-Semitic. There are Jews that stand. Most of them, in my opinion, are mentally ill. But there are certain diseases that unfortunately spread. You have epidemics. And what is remarkable here is that we have an epidemic of mental illness taking place among the Jewish people, among some Jews. And the seeds, if I could use that word, of this situation weren't just planted today. Unfortunately, the poison plants of these seeds are grown today, have become trees, but it was planted many, many years ago in the past. I always talk about universalism versus nationalism. And universalism, concern for human beings, is very important. My father was very concerned about all human beings. My father is a famous story, and as time passes on, I get additional details that I wasn't aware of when I was younger, but different people know the story. And each time I hear it, there's another detail. Just to give one example, there are many other such examples. My father, when he was a young man, he was in the subway trains in New York. And I should say, when I used to go in the subway trains in New York, my father used to always make me stand when he was there. He would make me stand by the wall. I would like to go close to the tracks to see if the train is coming. And my father would just say, go stand by the wall. And I didn't understand this is insistence, not in between, but by the wall. And I found out that my father was young. He was going in the subway trains in New York. A crazy lady pushed an anti-Semite, screaming something, some anti-Semitic statement, pushed him on the tracks. But in the process, she also fell on the tracks. My father, at those days, my father had a lot of strength in his hands. Later on, he became much weaker. People in Chicago don't know him when he had his full strength. I remember we lived on the second floor, and somebody on the 10th floor needed a table. And my father just held the table on his head, over his head, and went from the second floor to the 10th floor. He wasn't as strong as his grandfather, Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim, somebody once held him up. Reb Chaim took out a coin and bent it, and the robber ran away. But my father did have a lot of strength, especially in his hands. And he pulled himself off the tracks. And then he helped that lady who had pushed him on the tracks, who to a certain degree was an anti-Semite, but mentally ill, probably. Not unusual among the anti-Semites, both Jews and non-Jews. So he helped that lady get off the tracks. And a priest was there, and that priest ran over to my father, and he said to my father, "What's your name?" And my father said to him, "Aaron Soloveichik." So the priest said to him, "Bless me, I never saw a person as holy as you." My father was a Universalist. There are stories. I was a baby. I can't testify personally, but people talk how when my father was in the hospital and he had an emergency, and he had to call a doctor or a nurse or whatever it was, and he was very careful not to very careful to try not to wake up the patient, the other patient in the room. In those days, he didn't have private rooms in the hospital. I remember I was walking in the streets of the East Side, and there was a drunkard that fell in the snow. And my father ran to help pick him up. And it was a group of people that ran to help pick him up. It wasn't like today. 5, 6 people. But my father walked with the person till the block where the person said he lived, practically carrying that drunken person. And there was no reason to believe that that person was Jewish. It was on the Lower East Side, didn't talk Yiddish, probably was a non-Jew. But that my father was concerned about all human beings. My father, he was the Rosh Yeshiva, probably the outstanding Talmid Chacham in Chicago, one of the most outstanding Talmidei Chachamim of America and of the world. But if any human being would pass by, it could be the janitor. He would hold the door open for him. I remember a certain young Rosh Yeshiva took pride in the fact that my father held the door open for him. He attributed to the fact that my father understood how great this person's knowledge was. I didn't burst his bubble by telling him that my father held the door open for everybody, whether it was the janitor, whether it was a person who was drunk or whatever it was, because my father had great respect for every human being. So to a certain degree, he was a universalist. But my father's universalism came from his Judaism. It wasn't his Judaism coming from his universalism. Why is it that we see that there are Jewish people in the face of all logic who see in October 7th, who see children being put in an oven in front of their mothers, who hear about Jewish women being raped over and over again? Why is it that they protest against the Jews immediately after October 7th? Okay, they're mentally ill. But there's a philosophy, and that is their Judaism. And they even one little person who obviously, in my mind, was totally crazy, holds a shofar up to prove her point. Why is it? Because their Judaism emanates from the universalism. And this is the idea. You have to cut yourself off, not because we don't show respect for all human beings. We show respect for all human beings. We have to show respect for all human beings. But our universalism, our concern for all human beings, has to emanate from our Judaism. We mold our universalism on the basis of our Judaism. And there is universalism emanating from Judaism. Avraham Avinu, he runs to save Lot, even though Lot cut himself off from him. He runs to save Lot. And take a look when the Torah talks about Moshe Rabbeinu. When the Torah talks about it talks about Moshe Rabbeinu. So the first day Moshe Rabbeinu goes out. Moshe Rabbeinu sees Ish Mitzri, Makeh Ish Ivri Me'achab. He sees an Egyptian smiting a Jew. The second day he sees two Jews smiting each other. And then when he goes to Midian, he helps the daughters of Yisro. And there it's a fight between non-Jews and non-Jews. These, I heard a lecture that someone said, these represent the three forms of justice that Moshe Rabbeinu displayed his leadership qualities. Now, if you ask me, Moshe Rabbeinu was brought up in the palace of Paro. He probably saw non-Jews fighting each other throughout the years. Torah doesn't mention that. When the Torah presents it, it talks first of a Jew smiting, a non-Jew smiting a Jew. That was the first concern. And then the second concern was two Jews fighting each other. And then the third concern was two non-Jews. We have to be concerned. We have to be for justice. Even when it's a fight between two non-Jews. But our concern, the concern for the Jews come first. Because our universalism emanates from our Judaism. And even Avraham Avinu, immediately after the Gerus, after he established his own nation, he separated himself already. He established his own nation. What's the first thing? First thing is he sees three travelers, Bedouins, people who walk through the desert. He didn't know that they were Malachim. that there were angels, and he's concerned, and he says, he begs them, stay, rest yourself, I'll give you food. He's concerned for every human being. Why does the Torah tell that as the first thing after the Gerus? Because when our Judaism is to emphasize, our Judaism does not make us have a negative attitude on the contrary to other Jews. It gives a positive attitude to other Jews, to non-Jews. It gives us a positive attitude, but our concern for all human beings has to emanate from our Judaism. Avraham Ivri. Avraham on one hand, Ivri, hu me'ever echad, and kol olam is me'ever hasheni. He's in the other side of the world. And yet he becomes the universal figure, the major universal figure that there is in the world today. Avraham Ivri. Our concern, our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism. And this is what we have to understand today. Yes, we cut ourselves all over from the nations, but not because we're not concerned of people. We're always concerned. Israel is always the first to give aid when there's trouble, even against the nations that are not friendly to it. But what we have to know is that our universalism, our concern, which is probably greater than the concern that any other group had, has to emanate from our Judaism. And this is the halacha of Gerus. The halacha is, yes, we cut ourselves off, not because of a lack of concern, but because our concern has to emanate from our Judaism, not our Judaism from our concern for others. Okay.
When talking about the stranger, did Rabbi quote the chinuch?
The chinuch, yes. Na Abbas Ager.
Right. Yeah. I think it's in Akev, right? Or Teves Chanan or Akev.
Yeah.
Anyone has a question, put it in the chat, please. No questions there. I read it, I don't know how reliable it is, in the Art Scroll book about the Contrise Shiurim, Rav Gustman, that in Grodno, the boys would all have like contests of bending metal about the strength in their hands. I never heard those stories before,
Reb Chaim.
But so then they said there was one boy who was super strong. He can make the bent piece straight.
Okay.
So Tamim and Rav Shimon Shkap, I guess they were into the strength in their hands.
Okay, so my father had a lot of strength in his hands when he was younger. So that's he wouldn't be able to bend the coin like Reb Chaim, but I remember him just lifting a table up and walking 8 flights of stairs up because someone needed a table upstairs. So that's
Okay, there aren't any other questions here, so I'll end it here. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Rabbi, for the share.
okay. Okay, we'll be in touch.